just like a little hypothetical, just for the sake of discussion, I guess. What happens when the person tries the best they can to govern themselves and realizes that they can't do it?
You see, now you're bringing in Aristotelian acrasia to Platonic perfectionism. Right? So Plato is assuming that acrasia isn't real, that to know the good is to do it. So if you're mistaken about that, or if you know that something is evil and you choose it, yeah, that's possible under the Aristotelian assumptions, but under the Platonic assumptions, it's not possible. And the problem that I always keep coming back to is I don't know not only do I not know what the answer is, whether acrasia is real or not, or whether to know the good is to do it or not, I don't even know what would count as evidence. In other words, I have some understanding of what makes me go and what makes my choices go. I have considerably less understanding of what makes other people's choices go.
Can I add a question to this discussion, which has always bothered me in a way? Could you say that in case of Plato, confusion, so lack of knowledge, that is confusion, would do the same work as acrasia for Aristotle in stopping us from doing good? So in Plato, a person who does not act good, is a confused person, but he still wants to do good, so to speak.
Right. So the difference is moral responsibility. No one is responsible for not knowing things. No one is responsible for being ignorant of what is really good. So the difference is that Aristotle is going to hold people who are weak-willed and choose to commit murder anyway morally responsible, saying you did something wrong. Plato is going to look at the murderer and say, regrettably, you are so deeply ignorant that you believe murder to be a good thing. Right. Now, both Aristotle and Plato are going to execute the person after they do or do not hold them morally responsible. So it doesn't make all that much practical difference. It's primarily a theoretical difference in the way they understand philosophical psychology. Mm-hmm. Aristotle's going to put you to death because you're a weak-willed person that kills other people. Plato's going to put you to death with the greatest regret because, unfortunately, a person as ignorant as you is harmful to himself and others. And Plato putting that person to death is actually doing that person a favor because such a life is intolerable, far from worth living. The problem is that Plato makes sense, but it's so counterintuitive that somebody like Callicles says, look, is he joking or is he serious? The key thing is that that's a false distinction. Socrates is joking and he's serious, which is a very hard thing to get your mind around because he's messing with everybody's brain and obviously enjoying himself, but no one is more serious than Socrates. I mean, it's part of the many ironies that surround Socrates. No one is more seductive than Socrates, and at the same time, no one is more chaste.
I really like the way you put that because this is my first time reading Plato, and that was one of the things I'd always heard about Socratic irony, but this is one of the things as I found myself laughing a lot reading this dialogue, and just like laughing, I guess just at Socrates' irony and yet seriousness, and I had never thought to say it quite like that, but that captures it perfectly.
Well, I mean, again, that's the first thing Callicles asks when he enters the discussion. Is Socrates joking or is he serious? What that means is unask the question. The assumptions you're bringing to this are going to prevent serious discussion. So when you realize that Socrates is joking and he's serious, that will lead us to the various modes of Platonic poetry. Plato is the last and greatest poet of the Greek tradition. He writes a new genre. It's called Platonic dialogue. And what it is a combination of epic, lyric, comedy, and tragedy in the same book, in the same collection of things. Someone showed me that big red Cooper version. Well, what Plato intends to do is to supersede Homer as an epic writer. The dialogues taken together are a giant epic. He's also a great lyric writer. Since you're just starting Plato, go and read the Phaedrus. It's short and it's a small, flawless gem. Phaedrus. You'll love it. Also, Plato is simultaneously a comic writer and a tragic writer. So when in the Republic he gets rid of comedy and tragedy, he's not going to leave us without plays. He's just going to supersede all previous comedy and all previous tragedy with a new genre that he thought up, which is Platonic dialogue. Now, yeah, this is kind of megalomaniacal, unless, of course, you're sufficiently gifted to be able to make that work, in which case you're an appalling genius, which is what he was.
So out of curiosity, where would you place the laws, for instance, in that kind of...
The laws is, to my mind, an incomplete dialogue, and here's why. Plato's 80 years old, and he knows he's dying, all right? So he doesn't have time for all the poetic flourishes that he put into the middle period dialogues in particular. The laws is the very last of the late dialogues. Here's a guy 80 years old, and he doesn't have time to give people a lot of metaphors and interesting poetic turns of phrase. Here, he cranks his way through, and that's why the laws is a very difficult read. It's not nearly so enjoyable as the middle period dialogues, the Gorgias or the Symposium or the Republic. So by the time we get to the laws, Plato is actually trying to give us a sort of encyclopedia or compendium of the end part of his thought. The key thing here is that Plato's theory of forms, which he gives us in the Republic, Plato has abandoned it by the time he gets to the late period dialogues. And if there's no such thing as a form, that means there's no such thing as a form of the good. But if there's no such thing as the form of the good, then it's not easy to see what philosophers are exactly doing. The Statesman and the Sophist was originally supposed to be a trilogy, the Statesman, the Sophist, and the Philosopher. He never writes the philosopher because apparently he's not sure what philosophers are supposed to be doing if there's no form of the good to call long distance.
Oh, that's a great strategy, actually.
Right? If you get a chance to look at the laws, one of the most amazing things that I found when I read that, and it's been a while since I've looked at it because it's kind of dry, is that the whole place is a giant solar calendar. In other words, it's a, what do they call them? Not just a solar calendar, but it's a, what do they call? My brain's going. I'm sorry, gentlemen.
Sundial?
A sundial, that's it. It tracks the sun across the year. So the city in the laws is a giant sundial. It's a giant solar calendar. And you know what solar anything means for Plato? It's the form of the good. But he doesn't have forms anymore. So he has the nocturnal group meet in the morning trying to figure out what it is philosophers are supposed to be doing because he doesn't know.
Can you
Go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about the differences between dialectic and rhetoric? Because like what I remember from my college philosophy was dialectic is like the interplay of opposites. And then Aristotle described rhetoric as he said the difference is dialectic uses syllogisms, but rhetoric uses the enthymeme. And I was just kind of like wondering, like, am I correct when I think about this? Because like to me, dialectic is a lot of question and answer if I'm reading this dialogue correctly.
Dialectic is a fancy word for conversation. It's a back and forth between two or more people. Rhetoric is not a back and forth. It's one person making a speech and not asking for an interchange. In other words, it's one directional. It's the bi-directional quality of dialectic that makes it open-ended and contingent upon the person you're talking to. If you're giving a speech as a rhetorician, say as an attorney for the defense or the prosecution, what you're trying to do is persuade some third person, not the person on trial, because they know whether they're innocent or guilty. On the other hand, if you were engaging in dialectic with the person on trial, there you would be interested in persuading them. So the difference between dialectic and rhetoric, in some ways, can be thought of as the difference between what I call second-person rhetoric and third-person rhetoric. If you're trying to persuade some other person, that's the person you're talking to, that's dialectic. If you're trying to persuade a third person, not the person that you're talking to, but the person you're talking about, that's inevitably rhetoric.
Oh, good point.
I have a literary question.
Go ahead.
What's the role of the quotations of Euripides and such and Pindar throughout the dialogue? Are those just cultural artifacts? Are they appeals to authority? What role do they play literarily?
Yeah, Plato doesn't make appeals to authority except when he talks about the form of the good. The reason he quotes them is because he's trying to suggest that the tradition that they've inherited is corrupt and mistaken. So you can't imagine two people less alike than Euripides and Socrates, right? Both of them are ironic, but they have very different views of human nature. So look, one of the first people to be censored, if Socrates were to, magically take power in a regime, we're never going to have any more Euripides, because he undermines the public good. Most of what Socrates has to say about the Greek tradition, and what Plato has to say about the Greek tradition, is that it is deeply defective. And so when he quotes Homer or Pindar or Euripides, it's only with reference either to their mistakes or, ironically, that they got the right answer by accident.
So I know one of the classic analyses of the Republic is that it begins with "I went down, so I went down," as a reference to Plato entering the cave, which is an analogy he'll bring up later. Yep. I noticed that in Callicles' argument, he accuses Socrates of wanting to, spend time in philosophizing like a child because he's afraid of encountering the agora, the marketplace where men become prominent. And at the very beginning of the dialogue, actually, that whole dialogue begins, and they're talking, and he said, "Did we arrive late to the party?" And Socrates says, "Well, that's Chaerephon's fault. He kept us loitering in the marketplace." I wonder if you think that's a similar literary play.
Absolutely right. There aren't any accidents in Platonic dialogues. These things are constructed with the cunning of the insane. I mean, as you read into the great dialogues, everything is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. There's nothing superfluous and nothing that doesn't belong there. If you ever get to the point in reading the dialogues where you want to skip a few pages because you're at the boring part that doesn't make any sense, that means you're not understanding what's going on, right? So I'd be inclined to say that Plato is offering us a way of departing from the prior Greek tradition towards something new, but he himself changes his mind over the course of his career. And so by the end, when he's writing the laws, he's not quite sure what direction philosophy goes. He's not even quite sure what philosophy does. So I'd be inclined. Oh, Robin, please. Someone has raised their hand. How do we get that? Genevieve,
I'm wondering whether there's a point in the beginning of the dialogue where Socrates doesn't speak, and he starts talking with Polos, and like both of them, they don't speak. They have their delegates. Chaerephon speaks with Polos. Why is that?
Oh, because what this are examples of Socratic teaching and Gorgian teaching. Right? So those that have been taught by Gorgias have been told that they're geniuses, that they're amazingly intelligent, and that he will flatter them provided they give him large amounts of money. So what we see is the conflict between incomplete Socratics and incomplete sophists. And we see the tendencies that have been built into them already. Polis means colt in Greek. So he's a young, unsteady horse. And so we can't expect too much out of him. But the Socratic, those who have been taught by Socrates rather than Gorgias, have made some progress, but not enough to overcome the Gorgian tradition. Those who have been miseducated by Gorgias are under the misapprehension that they know a great deal and that they're really smart, because that's the way Gorgias earns his money. You'll see that in the Meno too. Meno is a student of Gorgias. One way of thinking about Socratic teaching is like this. A sophist teaches you for his benefit, which is why he charges you money. Socrates teaches you for your benefit, which is why he doesn't take payment. Does that make any sense? All right, well, look, we're 50 minutes into this. I'd like to talk a little bit before I go about what we're doing next week. Aristotle's Politics. Okay, it took me a long time before I really enjoyed Aristotle. When I was a young man, I think everyone is born genetically programmed to either be Aristotelian or Platonist. I mean, if you know, any of you who are teachers and try to teach this stuff, you gravitate towards one or the other, and it doesn't mean you don't respect the one you think is lesser, but the human mind is such that people seem to like one or the other disproportionately. Now, from the moment I encountered Plato, I loved it. I thought this is the most mind-bending stuff I have ever seen. I didn't begin to appreciate Aristotle until I was in my 30s. And here's what happened. I was talking to a professor at Princeton named Ted Rabb, and we were teaching together a big double credit course on the great books. And, you know, he was teaching the Aristotle and I was teaching Plato. And at the end of it, I said, that was a great lecture, but, you know, I can't see how anyone would ever be inspired by Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle is like the parts list to the universe, right? I mean, everything is listed, and then the subparts and the subparts, and then it all gets wrapped up, and that's the Aristotelian organon. What he said back to me was really telling. He says, well, the fact of the matter is, throughout thousands of years, people have been inspired by Aristotle because his mind is so blasted encyclopedic. I mean, he chugs through every possible domain of inquiry, doing the same thing. It's called analysis. He invents it, and he uses it on individuals, on constitutions, on tragedies, on animals, and his encyclopedic mind, which is not poetic, but is impressive in its completeness, has in fact inspired many generations of thinkers. And I thought about it and I realized he's right, that I'm reading Aristotle wrong, and I'm not, and I'm what I'm asking is that Aristotle should be Plato. And that's not reasonable. Why not just let Aristotle be Aristotle and then appreciate it for what's great about this? And what's great about the Aristotelian corpus is that it intends to be complete. The only thing Aristotle tells, I think this is in the Rhetoric, although I don't remember. My brain is like Swiss cheese these days. He says somewhere that metaphor is a sign of genius because it's the only thing that can't be taught. All right, what that means is it's the only thing that Aristotle believes he can't teach, which means that he successfully analyzed everything else in the universe. And you got to kind of like that. I mean, I admire a man who thinks big.
Just a quick question on that. How much do you think Aristotle's philosophy was produced in contraposition to Plato's?
All of it.
Because there's
Here's why.
Not just a difference of temperament, but also
Aristotle is the best student one could imagine because he studies his master, Plato, very seriously and very carefully. And then he tells his teacher that he's wrong. Now, this is not the destruction of Platonism. This is the high point of Platonism. This is what Plato is trying to teach people how to do. You're trying to figure out how to tell your teachers that they're wrong, but you can't just say that they're wrong and walk away. You have to explain why they're wrong and what it is that's right instead. And all of Aristotle's work is a commentary on Plato. There are other things that he adds because that's just a way of saying that Plato didn't include this, or Plato got this wrong, like the question of acrasia. But Aristotle is the greatest of teachers in the West, but also the greatest of students, because he respects his teacher enough to figure out why he disagrees and is capable of accounting for and describing why he disagrees. And Plato would be the first one to stand up and applaud that because that's what he's trying to teach you how to do. There aren't any Platonic dogmas. All there are Platonic provocations where it tells you weird stuff like criminals should really like being punished. Right? And then you say, hold on, are you telling what? And then you find out the logic behind Plato and you say, well, that's a really weird idea. I see what you're saying, but I still don't believe it. And then you spend, if you're like me, several months or several years thinking about why that drives you crazy. And like Aristotle, you eventually come up with a way of explaining why you think it's wrong. And every time you improve on Plato, you're validating Plato. That's why Plato is here to stay.
Is there a specific translation of politics you'd recommend?
Nah, I mean, I think it matters in the case of Plato more because he uses words in denotive as not just connotative ways, whereas Aristotle is more likely to be cut and dried denotation, right? The connotations of a crazier are not of interest to him. But Plato is really interested in the connotations of the sun because there's only one of it and it illuminates the world and it makes plants grow and does all kinds of great stuff.
I have a question, and it's related to that on translations. I've been reading Plato for quite some time, and I think a fellow Platonist like yourself, at least deep at heart anyways. But I find myself stumbling sometimes because I become skeptical about the translator himself. And what I mean by that is that I'm not, I don't have a working psychological understanding of ancient Greek. I do just out of like trying to catch bits and pieces of it, but I can't experience it. Mm-hmm. And when I come across something in a dialogue where they're using words that like grace or just things that seem so Christian in origin, I realize that that's the origin of Christianity, but I have a hard time when it was like the translator was actually a Jesuit priest, or how do you tackle that?
Okay, the pros need to learn the relevant languages, but you use them or you lose them. So like you, I'm not sure that I could order breakfast in Greek, despite the fact that I spent many years studying it. As we get older, we get dumber. But the best translations, as far as I'm concerned, are the ones that are consistently literal. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that Thomas Aquinas couldn't read Greek. He was reading Aristotle in a Latin translation by William of Moerbeke. And William of Moerbeke translated one word in exactly the same way across the Aristotelian corpus, because he said, look, you haven't come here to find out about William of Moerbeke, you're here to find out about Aristotle. And granted, it's not a beautiful translation, but it is literally an accurate translation. That's what Bloom did with the Republic, and I wish he had done more of that, because for Greekless readers, literal translations are far preferable. They're not beautiful, but the faithfulness more than repays that. And yes, I have to admit that I love Plato, but he can be trying sometimes with the weird stuff he says and the improbable, counterintuitive things he asks us to believe. But in my view, both Platonism and Christianity are different forms of monotheism. In other words, one worships the form of the good, which is like Yahweh without a personality.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it seemed very simple to me. Like, I know, someone must have put this together that, God and good are very close. There's just one missing O. And, the sun and all. Just come on, guys. Like, really? Like, let's just draw a picture here.
Well, I think that actually all of the great monotheisms, and my view is that includes Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and Platonism. All right. I think that they're all monotheistic religions. We are called upon to worship one good thing that really can't be described in literal speech. So you get various kinds of images and you get various kinds of metaphors. And this is speech, but it's not literal speech and requires a different set of principles and modes of interpretation. So my view is that religions, not just the monotheisms, but all religions, are languages. And that these languages give you a set of images or stories rather than a set of words. And there's an accepted way of deploying those images and words which correspond to the grammar of a language. Now, here's my big point. There's no such thing as a false language. There are only sentences can be true and false. Asking what the true language is a category mistake. So my first language is Christianity, but I have a near native command of Platonism. I have a lesser understanding of the other monotheisms, and I have a still lesser understanding of Buddhism or Confucianism and the other great traditions. But I think all of them are neither true nor false because it doesn't apply to languages. That's a set of categories that only applies to sentences. So I'm much more interested in what people say in it than the language in which they say it.
Well said.
That's something to think about. That will bend your head if you play with that for a while.
Oh no, I like it. I'm gonna wait for the book to come out. That should be. Well, isn't that's got to be somewhat of a magnum opus for you, right? I mean that's
it's a long story, but I started a history of the world because I got very sick and I was offered a large sum of money. I figured I'd give it to my children. So I have maybe 300, 400 pages written, and it's less than half done. And because I'm still very sick, it's never going to get done. But that would be a small fragment of what I was doing, yeah.
Oh, good.
If you look me up on Substack, some of the parts are there.
Yeah.
Cool.
What does Nietzsche mean by Christianity being Platonism for the masses?
What it means is that it's an otherworldly religion in which we focus on, in the case of Platonism, the realm of the forms, and in the case of Christianity, heaven. But you access it in one case by having superior rationality. That's the elitist form, Platonism. Or you access it by religious faith and revelation, which is the democratic form, because you don't have to be smart to have religious faith.
I like the part you said about Socratic irony. I thought Nietzsche was maybe being a little unfair when he said that because of the Socratic irony and because he said Plato changed his view in the laws about where philosophy's direction should be.
Well, granted, Nietzsche was certainly being unfair, but you have to remember that he made a career of that.
Can you say,
ladies and gentlemen, I'll let you go. Thank you for coming. I didn't know that people like to read books anymore, but I think about this stuff all the time. And since we're living in the age of COVID and monkeypox and God knows what else, we can't get out as much as we would like. But this comes close to being a Platonic discussion, and I'm very happy with the quality of the questions you've asked. I hope that you have a set of questions that's as good when we get to Aristotle. And I have to tell you in advance, I have an amazing mind-bending read of Castiglione when we get to him.
Can I ask one last question?
What?
Can I ask one last question?
Yeah, go ahead. Ask a question.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying. You said about the pre-Socratics, like they were the first scientists that actually shook the world in a way. So this is what actually the philosophers like Plato tried to actually organize all these new ideas. Since like in the 1900s in mathematics and physics, which actually is my field, there is a great revolution. Should we actually also reevaluate our values and the way we pursue?
Absolutely right. That's a really good question. And you would bring it up last because I can go on for this for hours. But here's the deal. My history of the world is organized around the history of physics, not just Western physics, physics everywhere. Because it turns out the Chinese actually, in the 300s BC, actually work out something like pre-Socratic physics. It has many homologies, if not identities. And since you're a mathematician, you know what a homology is. Okay. I think that there were three most important scientific revolutions in the history of the world. The first was pre-Socratic physics. Well, actually, we had physics before that. That was just myth physics. We tell stories. God creates the heaven and the earth in Genesis. That's what I would call physics 1.0. Physics 2.0 is pre-Socratic physics. And there's a Chinese version of that as well. What that does is demythologize the world and change the question about the physical world from who did that to what did that. And keep in mind that asking new questions is more important than providing new answers. A good question is worth its weight in gold, whereas answers are just silver at best. Now, the third, and each time that we have a scientific revolution, it necessarily creates a transformation in every other domain of culture, which is what we see during the age of the sophists in Greece. They took this new science and used it to undermine Greek morality and Greek politics and Greek religion. And that was what was holding the polis together. Once those bonds are loosed, the polis is in danger of falling apart. That's why Socrates and Plato and Aristotle decide to create philosophy. It's not something they do on a lark. It's something they do because the roof is going to cave in. In other words, it's a necessity. Now, the third, so that would be science 2.0. Science 3.0 is Renaissance and Enlightenment science, which reaches its high point in Newtonian mechanics. What do we get as a result of that? Of necessity, all the other domains of culture go through a revolution, which is why we no longer accept the political theory which justifies rulership on the basis of God. Now it's based upon the consent of the governed. We're going to get a new idea introduced. It's called the social contract. And that's what's going to change the political theory and the moral theory, if you think about somebody like Kant, from the earlier tradition. And these transformations have to happen once any scientific revolution happens. Now we get, with the quantum universe and relativity, beginning, let's say, the very end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we find the limitations of Newtonian mechanics, and we find new ways of describing things that are very, very big and very, very small. Of necessity, this transforms our understanding of ethics, politics, law, art, religion, and that's what Nietzsche is. That's what Freud is. That's what the theater of the absurd is. That's what video is. So I think you've asked me a pregnant question, but I can't deliver the baby just now. All right, but thank you. That's a really good question. Thank you all for asking good questions. There's nothing I like better than good questions. And hopefully next week we'll be able to have the same sort of dialectic, and perhaps I could do a little less rhetoric. I'll talk to you all then.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Bye.
Thank you.